Well, hello everyone again. If you came to my previous session about keywording, it's great to have you back. And if you didn't, then we'll be touching on keywording today as well. But this session today is just a quick run through some ideas around the ideas of accessibility and inclusion and diversity within the content creation industries. So we're going to look at a few key themes today: the responsibility of the creative community, diversity and inclusion, accessibility, and alt text, which is going to be explained in greater detail, but this is part of the technological accessibility issues that I'd like to talk about today. So our responsibility as content creators, obviously, we're looking to create content that's relevant, that resonates with today's audience, and for it to be authentic and realistic. And these are not new concepts to us, we're all very familiar with that. But we need to unpick that a bit further and see how that actually plays out. So how, if we're creating content, can we use this to tell stories that will resonate with our audience? And this is really important for brands who have a very strong brand message. And I think I mentioned earlier, they wanted to be able to internally communicate these brand values, but also externally send those messages out to their audience. So for that, they need to be thinking about how their audience is made up of a diverse group of individuals and communities, and they need their content to speak to those different communities. So we're going to look at how diversity feeds into that marketing toolkit. Accessibility, what do we mean by that? And do we mean accessibility of content in terms of, does it have resonance and meaning, but also the technical aspect of accessibility as well. So when you go onto a search engine and type in a certain search term or a query, does it allow you access to that content? And if not, why might that be the case? And obviously, as part of content creating community, we want to include all the different types of people that we're communicating with. So inclusion is kind of the other key area to look at today. So as creators of and publishers of content, we must ensure that content is representative and accessible to as many users as possible. So these are users regardless of their background, their education, or their demographic group. And we need the content to demonstrate inclusivity for diverse cultures and individuals. So I was thinking about the context in which we create content now, with so much of it being published online and all of this accessible through keyword search and this kind of thing. We need to make sure that the content is optimized for search. But the problem that we have is there are large portions of the community that are being currently marginalized, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail. So by this, I mean that there are big sections of communities across the world using the World Wide Web who, for whatever reason, are being prevented from finding and accessing content, which is very troubling and obviously needs to be addressed. So I'm based in the UK, and according to the UK government, at least 1 in 5 people here in the UK have a long-term illness, impairment, or disability. So with particular emphasis on search, this disability, if it's a visual impairment or blindness, for example, will mean that you cannot search very easily and find visual content unless the content is being optimized for those groups. So getting into a little bit more legalities, which I'm only going to really scratch the surface of here, but under the UK law, if a business's website isn't accessible, then the website owner could actually be sued for discrimination. So that's a kind of broad area to be thinking about in the UK in terms of our responsibility. A company that I'm really interested in called Scribely, which you can just see on the right-hand side of this slide. Their Twitter handle is Scribely Tribe. And they have posted this on Twitter, which I have borrowed for the purpose of this discussion. And these are quite compelling statistics that show us that the number of lawsuits that are happening in the US has been rising in the region of 23% in the last year or so. So these are cases that are being taken out against websites that are not actually making themselves accessible to these groups in society. So therefore, people searching from these groups are being marginalized. And we want to obviously understand why that is the case. So this is according to the definition of accessibility by the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. So if you do a quick search on a website such as Getty Images, which is a major stock photo site, for the keyword diversity, you'll get something back like this. In fact, this is the very first set of results you get on Getty Images for diversity. And we can see, I mean, a number of these I've actually keyworded because I do work with Getty photographers, and we can see that, say, for the top right-hand image and the ones to the left of that, we've got multicultural groups of different ages interacting, you know, mixed families, mixed communities, and this is what people really need to see when they search imagery on stock photo sites. So they want a representation that shows diverse people, and they will actually use that keyword to find this imagery. So it's really important how we apply the keyword and how we make sense of it. And what we're seeing here is a fairly kind of similar set of results with a couple of graphic style images to kind of, you know, vary the mix a little bit. And then if we look at another stock photo website called Shutterstock, we see that the diversity results for the very first, I think, 7 images is quite different. So we've got quite a few similars from one sort of set, which actually doesn't give us as users much diversity. It's quite a sort of flat representation of how diversity looks in the world of stock photography compared with this set of results. So the language and the search terminology that we're using to describe diversity makes a massive impact on what users see when they go online to find visual content. And we can just see that, you know, the idea of diversity being just, let's make sure we cover all the boxes and tick all the boxes for different people, skin color or different genders. You know, this isn't really what we mean by diversity anymore. We mean something that's a little bit more human focused and more aligned to our day-to-day experiences. So if we're thinking about diversity and inclusion from a search perspective, we start moving towards, okay, so we're thinking of diversity visually and how we expect that to look, but now we're looking at what that means for the technology side of making a search online, and how would you classify your content to make it diverse and inclusive. So as part of that, we've got obviously keywords starting at the top here, top right, and keywords that are relevant and accurate. They're not biased keywords or offensive keywords in any way. Another part of this process is using alt text, and we'll talk about that in a little while, but alt text or alternative text is essentially another way of communicating to disabled or visually impaired audiences what an image actually shows. And this is something that your HTML code will include. So on your website, if you are using alt text, you are instantly becoming more accessible to your diverse audience and including people from all different backgrounds. You can also use these keywords which are targeting your different diverse and rich communities in your copywriting. So you want to make sure that the keywords you're adding to the content to kind of define it, as we've seen with the search engine example, is also brought into your copywriting, and using the same principles of, you know, non-offensive language and being sensitive where that's needed, but also being, you know, as rich and varied as you need to be in the way you're describing your people and your situations and environments. Again, this plays a big part in the brand message, because what you put out in your content, whether it's visual content, photos and videos, GIFs, you know, that kind of thing, and what you're writing in your copy all ties together to create, you know, your reputation or the way people view your brand and how they kind of feel about your brand. So it's really important. So ethnicity is a large area, obviously, as is gender and sexuality, and also socioeconomic groups. And those big areas, obviously there's many layers to each of those, but what I wanted to just highlight was the fact that each one of these areas will have terminology associated with it, which is always changing. So however we've described people in the past may be subject to change in the future, and we're certainly feeling that that's the case in the world of stock photography right now. when we're thinking about accessibility, we want to know kind of where the guidance is coming from. And the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, is the main provider of guidance and resource for this community. So the W3C will provide strategies and standards to help businesses make their websites more accessible. They've also produced a set of accessibility guidelines, which is called the WCAG, and this is recommendations for making websites primarily accessible for people with disabilities or impairments. So obviously they want to make accessibility, they want to improve accessibility for all web users. So they're also looking at things like devices, and so mobile phones, for example, is a particularly tricky area for accessibility. So this is something that the WCAG also help with. And all of this information is published in the public domain. So if you want to dive deeper into any of that, feel free to look up the W3C on the internet. So we were talking about alt text, which stands for alternative text. And this is really important because this allows businesses and organisations that are publishing content that includes visual content, so photographs and videos and charts and graphs, not always, pictographic. They could be pie charts or anything like that. You have the opportunity to enhance access to that content by including alternative text. So typically you would have a description of what you can see in the visual, and this will identify the primary focus. So much with keywording, as the case with keywording, you want to really pick out what the most relevant and main focus of that image is, and you want to include that in your alternative text. So another big part of alternative text, of course, if you are visually impaired and you can't see the image, and also Google can't see the image, you need to put it into context. So rather than just describing what the image is and what we can see, we're trying to kind of help a user who can't experience that themselves to understand the context behind it. So we start looking more at adding keywords and phrases for the meaning and the context of the visual. As we do with keywording creative content, you'll also want to include some concepts in more sort of artistic and creative imagery, and this is also part of your alt text description. And because we see images on all social media platforms, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, this is something you can apply across all of those platforms. So obviously, this is something that's going to take a little bit of time, but this is something that's really important, and given the fact that there are, legalities around this. So how does alt text work? I mentioned earlier that it's part of your HTML code, so it actually sits in the development of your website. It's read by screen readers, which is technology used by the visually impaired and blind community. So when they are engaging with a website and there are images, graphs, charts, videos, whatever, the screen reader will actually tell them what the alt text has for that particular visual. So it will tell them what the description is of the visual, what that means within its context, any concepts around that, and what the purpose or intention is of the graphic or the image. So as I said, Google can't see the visual content, so it can't see any photos or videos, but it can read the alt text. So when Google is trawling through its content and it's reading the words on your website, it's also reading the text that sits behind your images in your alternative text pages. And then that gives you improved search page results as well. So not only would you be making yourself more accessible to a broader, diverse community, you're also making yourself more searchable on Google, which is always good for any business or organization. So it's actually part of your SEO strategy as well. So in terms of writing alt text, this is not something I am an expert in by any means, but I've done a lot of research and there are some really great companies. I mentioned Scribely earlier on. They're definitely worth looking up. They actually specialize in the creation of alt text for videos and images, and organizations that need to optimize access to a more broad audience. Another great source is the W3C tutorials page, and I have a link which I'd like to share with you at some point. This actually walks you through how to write your alt text title, your image description, your long description, which will include more nuanced language and concepts, and how to actually structure and format the text behind that. And there's also some guidance on file names, because if you can create unique file names for each of your visual assets, this is also good for SEO, but it's also good for the screen reader community as well. So what alt text is? Alt text is a way of describing visual content. So the primary focus is the subject and the main elements of the image and the context within which that sits. And it's really important to give context, because an image without that doesn't have any value for somebody who cannot see the web page and cannot put the content, the written copy, in relation to why the image or the graphic is being used. So we'll have a look at an example of alt text in a little while, but usually it does also includes concepts, because a lot of imagery is used in a creative context, and we want to make sure that that message is getting across. But also it could be just descriptive information about what we can literally see in the graphic or the image or the video. And obviously, because visual assets are used on all different social media platforms, including LinkedIn and Twitter, Facebook and Pinterest and blog posts and everything else, it's really important to make sure that wherever possible you can actually use alt text in all of those cases. So how does alt text work? Well, it's part of your HTML. It's in your web page, it's in your actual back end of the coding, and it's read by a screen reader. So you can use screen reading technology if you're blind or visually impaired to tell you what is on a web page, including images. So bearing in mind, you may not be able to see the image and Google may not be able to see the image. If there's alt text in there behind the image in the back end, then it will be read and it will be understood within the context that it's being used. So it's really important if we're talking about engaging with that community of users that may have a disability. So this allows Google to in effect trawl imagery and video in the same way it trawls copy. So it's also part of your SEO strategy in that sense. But it does rely on the alt text being there in order for you to fully kind of reach that audience and engage with those users. So alt text is actually broken down into four main areas, and there's a lot of really helpful information and resources available to you online. The W3C has some really good tutorials, and it will walk you through the different steps for how to add alt text to your images. So the first one, the way of looking at it is it's a very, very brief description of the image or the visual, and there's an actual character limit on this of 125 characters. So as you can imagine, it's a few words to really pinpoint the main focus of the image, and this is called the alt text. It's also known as the alt tag or the image description, and that's the first part. The second part is the alt title, and this is the little bit of text that you might see if you hover over an image online, and if there's something up with the website, or indeed if you're using a screen reader, there's a little yellow box that comes up when your cursor passes the visual, and it'll give you a little title of what the visual is. This is even shorter, typically 1 to 5 words. Then you have a long description. This is a separate field to describe and explain what's being shown. This goes into a lot more detail. I don't believe there's a limit as such on this field. It's really important to get across the concepts, the context, the meaning, why the image is being used, what the purpose of it is. You can even describe, that it is supposed to lead you to another part of the website. It's, there's different calls to action that can be used in your long description. So So it's quite different to the first stage, which is just the alt text, you know, the 125 characters. The description goes into a lot more detail. And then you have a file name. So each asset has an individual file name. And sometimes the images might be called, you know, image 1, image 2, image 3, but that's not very helpful for anybody, especially somebody who's reliant on a screen reading technology to understand and engage with the internet. So if your image type, your file names are unique, and meaningful in some way, and they do prefer that you separate words with hyphens. So for example, you know, dog hyphen eating hyphen bone, for example. This would be, as an image name, this would be much more useful than just calling it image or dog, for example. So, for example, we might have a title which is a close-up of a person in a burnt orange sweater holding a pen to a blank page in a notebook. And even if you close your eyes, you can really visualize what that might look like. You might not get everything, for example, the angle of the shot or how close up the shot is, because you can't see the image, but you can get a really good idea of what that composition might look like and how it might be useful or relevant to the work that you're working on, or the project that you're working in at that point in time. Again, if you looked at the long description here, you might have something much more detailed. This is a close-up interior of a person in a burnt orange sweater, so layering on more meaning here, holding a pen to a blank page in a notebook, resting atop a white desktop. So they're getting much more detail in, which is really creating this visual in your mind's eye. They wear a hair tie around their wrist, and their other hand rests gently on the opposite page of the notebook. So really, without seeing the picture, we've got a stronger sense of what is happening in the picture. And again, all of this will be trawled by Google and other search engines when they're looking to find a relevant match for your search query. So imagine if you are unable to see the visual content on the internet very clearly, or you have an impairment, or you're a blind user. You can still use the internet and you can still search and you can still get content back, and some of it might be relevant, but you've got to really rely on people adding alt text. So if you could just imagine yourself in a situation where an image has been returned to you based on a search, and the alt text tells you something about the image, but you can't see the image. And let's say the alt text tells you this is a long shot of a San Francisco cable car as it moves down the track of a steep street. Now, you know, I've been to San Francisco, and I think I could probably visualize what a cable car in San Francisco looks like, but it's giving us in this alt title a little bit of information. So it's a long shot. So you've got a sense of space in the image, even though you can't actually see the image, you're getting some information here, and it's moving down the track. So you get the sense that this cable car is moving away from the camera. So you may be imagining there's some perspective happening here, and you needing to know a little bit more at this stage. So the title is giving you some information, but it's leading you into wondering what else is happening in the image, because not all images of cable cars going down the street are the same. You know, there'll be different compositions, different colors, tones. They'll have people, some will have no people. It could be any number of things. So this is where the long description becomes really, really helpful. So taking this a step further, if we were to think of the long description, how this can help you understand what the image is actually showing. In this case, we have a description that says it's a sunny, long shot view of a San Francisco cable car as it moves down the tracks of a steep street. The green and red cable car with cables overhead is labeled with the number 13, and it has 3 destinations. So it's getting really specific. You might even know these places if you're living in that area and you use this particular route. So the 3 destinations: Powell and Market, Hyde and Beach, and Fisherman's Wharf, which is a fantastic place if you've ever been. The street is lined with multi-story homes with bay windows. So this is not just a street of buildings. These are homes. These are residential buildings, and they've got bay windows. So there's like an extra dimension coming into the text description here. And then it finishes with the San Francisco Bay and Bay Bridge are in the distance. So we talked about understanding the context and what that means, and this sets the scene. And if you were looking for content to promote the tourism of this area and the fantastic infrastructure and the amazing, traditional form of transport. And you wanted an image that really packed all of that in with this sense that you can see the San Francisco Bay and you can experience something through the image. Then this is really powerful, and it's really going to help people who are working with the marketing and commercial side of a business who cannot engage with this content unless they have these sorts of information, this detail, this level of detail within the alt text. So I hope that was a good play on words visually for people. If you just close your eyes and have a think about how important that would be if you were reliant on that technology. And this is something that we need to obviously promote more broadly on many more websites than are currently using this technology. So yes, there is a process to it. There's a lot to kind of think about, a lot to remember. Some of it builds on basic keywording principles that we've talked about before. Some of it's a bit more technical when you think about the different fields and the way you set this up in HTML. But as I've mentioned, you can go to the W3C website and get a flowchart, which is very, very helpful. The flowchart is a kind of, does your website contain imagery, yes or no? Is the imagery descriptive? Is it aesthetic? Is it, infographic? And it will walk you through that process so you can really understand how to use alt text, how to format it and construct it so that you can communicate more broadly to your diverse group of users. And that's pretty much all I was going to say on alt text, and it takes us back full circle to the purpose of creating diverse content that will include all of the different user groups that we have globally. Also means we need to make it accessible to those people and to people who can't engage with the technology in the way we expect to, for example, as able-bodied people. And this is definitely becoming it's gaining much more traction in the community that I work with, not least in the world of stock photography, where we need to represent these people from different communities and then serve them on their search journey on the internet.
Clemency, one of the things that I recall about accessibility here in the States is that there was a large retailer that was sued by a not-for-profit visual impairment advocacy group and about accessibility. The retailer lost the settlement, paid like $6 million, corrected the website. They now bill themselves as American with Disabilities Act compliant. I had the foolish notion that that was going to be like one of the last type of lawsuits that we were going to see in this country or around the world. But I'm still kind of stunned that people were willing to go to court rather than delay a project 3 or 6 months and spend a few hundreds of thousands of dollars to make it compliant, and they'd rather spend millions of dollars in court costs and lawsuits. And I'm just wondering what the temperature is. I mean, what the reality is in the UK and on your side of the pond. Are people complying with disability guidelines from the government and from third-party organizations like the World Wide Web Consortium?
Well, I think there's a lot of variation in that, because although we've got some guidance from the consortium on what accessibility means, it's still up to the individual regions or countries to make the governance, and your interpretation of that can vary. So I think you're right, people will be willing to do the bare minimum at times because they're willing to pay, to pay the cost for any lawsuits that arise from that. I think what we're trying to see is a shift in mindset and a genuine commitment to making content accessible, regardless of the fact that it could cost you money if you don't, because that's not really the key motivator for accessibility advocacy groups. It's about inclusion. So here in the UK, we also have, Institute representing the blind community, who I know have taken out cases. They don't always go to the law courts; they're often settled outside of the courts, but they will take you, take action against you if you're not fulfilling these accessibility guidelines. And it's very easy to demonstrate that and highlight ways that that's happening. It just doesn't mean that people will go ahead and invest the time and resources in getting it right. Obviously, smaller companies might be a little bit more worried about having action taken against them, but it seems to be the bigger organizations that the advocacy groups will be going after, because they have this responsibility, which, we talked about at the beginning. It is a responsibility that we have to not only talk about being accessible, but actually, put that into practice and build it into our systems and processes. So yeah, I mean, if the larger groups, like, the large retailers and e-commerce groups are being targeted, then to my mind, that's not a bad thing, because they are setting the scene for other businesses to follow suit, and they should be, being, made accountable for that. I'm not too familiar with the other European countries, but I know this is something that is gaining quite a lot of attention in the UK, because people are becoming aware that they are, subject to being penalised if they're not showing that they're accessible on their web pages.
Yeah, one of the things that surprised me, because I had done some research years ago about the business case for accessible content on the web, and I looked at just with visual impairments, that if you took the buying power of the traditionalists, those that were the parents of the baby boomers, plus the boomers, plus the people that had long-term visual impairments regardless of age, you were looking at trillions of dollars in buying power. And I think I just had the expectation that if there wasn't some sort of enforcement of accessibility, that the free market would start to take care of it. I'm one that if I see an interesting article on a website and the contrast is so bad, I used to go in, select the text, paste it into a text editor, and then I just so we could read the article. And now I just said, why would I bother? I'll go to a different site, and somebody else will get my eyeballs, and maybe even I'll purchase something from that site. I don't know, but I don't think I think perhaps it's because content is just spawning at such rapid rates. New sites come up, and there's all sorts of alternatives that people aren't really facing free market pressure, or sometimes you just get locked into a site. Like if you're trying to renew a driver's license or something like that, you have one site you can go to in the state of Michigan. And thankfully, it's pretty accessible in that case. I know in other states it's not. And you don't have an alternative other than to wait in line at a building.
I mean, I'm of the opinion it's not good enough to just blame competition for some of these problems. You could go somewhere else. You don't have to use our site. I think, again, it boils down to responsibility and taking ownership for what you publish and how that looks.
What I've discovered too is that good design is accessible. And from what I've heard you say, it's not just about the lawsuit, it's about doing the right things. And it's also going to be a better business decision, because when you design for accessibility, you make it more inclusive so that it's better for everyone.
Yeah, and I think this is part of the guidelines for the consortium, the World Wide Web Consortium, is that they have a responsibility to focus on groups that have disabilities and impairments, because it's not equitable at the minute. To make it equitable, we need to address those groups first, the most vulnerable. But then, yes, absolutely, we need it to be more accessible for everyone. And I think, Scott, your point about the contrast on a web page, that's all about design. That's a quick fix, actually, to change the way something looks. I mean, I'm sure the front-end developers would disagree with me, but this is all part of the strategy of your web design. And, behind that outer layer of design and how it looks aesthetically, you've got the underneath layer of how does it work technically, and then what does that mean for all of the user groups. So yeah, for everybody, I think I've written a bit more recently about information, accessibility to information. It's a human right. Everything we're accessing online now, we're so reliant on it, and we really expect what we read to be true and honest and representative of what we're asking the internet to give us. So, and somebody is responsible for that. They're responsible for creating it, curating it, uploading it, keywording it. adding the alt text. And if you're not taking responsibility for that, then you're really just operating on a very commercial level, which it's, that works if you're very profit driven, but if your business does stand by its values and it has some core brand message that it wants to convey, then this aspect of your website is one of the best ways that you can demonstrate that, I believe.
Thank you for joining us, Clemency. Where can our viewers find you online?
My website is clemency.co.uk, and you can find me on LinkedIn searching for Clemency Wright.